The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of a bright yellow notice stuck to my front door. At first, I thought it was another one of the HOA's ridiculous warnings about mailbox colors or lawn height. But when I peeled it off and read the words, my stomach dropped. According to the HOA, my backyard, land that had been part of my family's property for decades, was now considered community space, and I had exactly 2 weeks to remove my fence and allow public access. I read the notice again, convinced I was misunderstanding something. But no, the message was clear. The HOA had decided, without my input or consent, that a portion of my land no longer belonged to me. They cited some vague, revised zoning adjustments and claimed that the land was needed for a neighborhood beautification project. It didn't make sense. I had lived here for years, and that land had always been mine. It was properly marked on every deed, every survey, every document I had ever received. But the HOA, led by its power-hungry president, had apparently decided they had the right to change that. I immediately marched down to the HOA office, demanding an explanation. The office secretary barely glanced at me before shoving a copy of the newly approved HOA map across the desk. Sure enough, my backyard had been absorbed into the community's shared green space. I asked to see the legal documents that justified this change, but the secretary just smirked and told me to take it up with the board at the next HOA meeting. That meeting couldn't come fast enough. When the day finally arrived, I walked in with a folder full of property records, ready to shut this nonsense down. But as soon as I entered the room, I realized I was walking into a trap. The HOA president, a smug man named Greg, was already seated at the head of the table, flanked by his usual cronies. The moment I brought up the land grab, he waved a stack of papers in the air, claiming that everything had been properly approved and that I must have missed the notices. I hadn't missed anything. There had been no vote, no discussion, no legal notice filed with the county. This was a blatant attempt to steal my land under the guise of neighborhood improvements. I pointed this out, my voice calm but firm, and Greg just smiled, leaning back in a chair as if this was all a game to him. He told me I could file an appeal, but that it wouldn't matter. The HOA had already hired a contractor to remove my fence next week. That's when I realized something. Greg wasn't expecting me to fight back. He thought I was just another homeowner who would grumble, but ultimately roll over and accept whatever the HOA decided. He thought I would give up. He was about to learn how wrong he was. I left that meeting more determined than ever. Greg and his HOA cronies thought they had all the power, but they had made one massive mistake. They underestimated me. They expected me to panic, to accept their so-called decision, to quietly let them steal what was mine. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. The first thing I did was call a real estate attorney. Within an hour, I had an expert reviewing my property deed, boundary surveys, and every legal document tied to my home. As I expected, the HOA had no legal claim to my land. My backyard was clearly marked as private property, and the HOA had zero authority to seize it. What they were attempting wasn't just unethical, it was outright illegal. Next, I went to the county records office to see if the HOA had filed anything with the city, if they had legally changed zoning maps or attempted to reclassify my property. There would be an official record. But when the clerk pulled up the files, I wasn't surprised to see nothing. The HOA had never submitted any paperwork. They hadn't even attempted to go through legal channels. They had just redrawn their little community map and expected me to accept it. That was all I needed to hear. While the HOA prepared for their so-called beautification project, I was preparing for war. I started by sending Greg and the board a cease and desist letter through my lawyer, making it clear that their actions were illegal and that any attempt to enter my property would result in legal action. I also filed a formal complaint with the city's zoning commission, alerting them that the HOA was trying to enforce fraudulent land claims. Greg must have received the letter because the next day, he stormed up my driveway, fake smile plastered on his face. He told me I was blowing this out of proportion and that the HOA was simply acting in the best interest of the community. I calmly told him that trespassing on my land would result in immediate legal action and that if he or anyone from the HOA so much as touched my fence, they would be dealing with the county sheriff. He laughed. Actually laughed. Then, with a condescending smirk, he said, "You can fight all you want, but the contractor is already scheduled. That fence is coming down next week." I just smiled back, because what Greg didn't know was that I had already taken things far beyond just a legal complaint. I had contacted a local news station, and they were very, very interested in what the HOA was trying to pull. The day before the HOA's scheduled demolition, my street was anything but quiet. A news van was parked right outside my house, a reporter and her cameraman setting up for a live broadcast. A few curious neighbors gathered around, whispering as they watched the scene unfold. Some of them had been harassed by the HOA before, but were too afraid to speak out. Not anymore. I stood at the edge of my yard, arms crossed, waiting. Greg had no idea what was about to hit him. The moment he arrived, he looked completely caught off guard. He had expected to waltz in, order his hired contractors to rip down my fence, and declare victory. Instead, he was greeted by a microphone shoved in his face and a reporter asking him why the HOA was attempting an illegal land grab. His usual smug expression wavered, his eyes darting between the cameras and me. He tried to recover, flashing his fake politician smile, claiming that the HOA was simply making improvements for the community. But the reporter wasn't buying it. She pulled out the county records I had provided, showing that no legal action had ever been filed to reclassify my land. She read excerpts from the cease and desist letter my lawyer sent, which outlined the potential legal consequences of Greg's actions. The smugness drained from his face completely. He turned to me, his voice lower, angrier. He accused me of bringing unnecessary attention to the neighborhood, of making this a bigger deal than it needed to be. I just smiled and asked the reporter if she wanted a quote. That's when things really fell apart for Greg. One of the neighbors, a quiet elderly man named Mr. Thompson, suddenly spoke up. He told the reporter that his backyard had also mysteriously shrunk on the HOA's new map. Another neighbor added that she had been fined repeatedly for property violations that didn't exist, ones Greg had personally enforced. More and more people stepped forward, sharing their own horror stories of Greg abusing his position, making up rules to suit himself, and pocketing HOA fees without clear records of where the money was going. The floodgates had opened. The news crew ate it up, filming every testimony as Greg's face turned redder by the second. He looked like a man drowning, scrambling for an excuse, a way out. But there wasn't one. The more he tried to talk his way out of it, the worse it got. Then, as if the universe had perfect timing, two vehicles pulled up, the county zoning commissioner and a sheriff's deputy. The zoning commissioner wasted no time. He walked straight up to Greg and informed him that an official investigation had been opened into the HOA's land claims. The sheriff's deputy followed, handing Greg a notice that any attempt to alter my property, or anyone else's, would result in immediate arrest for trespassing and destruction of private property. Greg looked like he was about to be sick. His hands trembled as he tried to argue, but the sheriff shut him down. He had no authority here. Not anymore. I leaned in, just loud enough for him to hear. "I told you this was illegal. You should have listened." Greg had no response. He turned on his heel and walked away, humiliated, as the cameras followed his every step. The HOA's little power play had just blown up in their faces. But this wasn't over, because I wasn't just stopping them. I was going to destroy them. Greg and the HOA board must have thought the worst was over after the cameras left, but they had no idea what was coming next. I had spent years putting up with their ridiculous fines, their micromanaging, and their abuse of power. But this? Trying to steal my land? That was their final mistake. The day after their failed land grab, I met with my lawyer again. With all the evidence I had, fraudulent maps, illegal notices, and the public humiliation caught on video, we had more than enough to take serious legal action. The zoning commissioner's office was already involved, but I wanted to go further. I filed a lawsuit against the HOA for attempted property theft, harassment, and emotional distress. And I wasn't the only one. The moment the neighbors saw Greg's downfall, they realized they didn't have to live in fear anymore. Mr. Thompson, the elderly man whose backyard had also been shrunk on the HOA's fake map, filed a complaint of his own. More neighbors followed, some suing for wrongful fines, others for harassment. A few even requested a full financial audit of the HOA's spending, because where was all that money going? Greg and the remaining board members started panicking. Suddenly, the people they had controlled for years were turning against them. Then, things got even worse for them. The city had taken a lot of interest in the HOA after the news story aired. An investigator from the county clerk's office started digging through their records. And what they found was enough to bring the whole corrupt operation crashing down. Misallocated funds, overpriced contractor fees that led back to Greg's personal account, illegal fines issued without approval. It wasn't just bad management, it was outright fraud. The city wasn't about to let that slide. A few weeks later, HOA board members started resigning left and right. Some of them ran the moment they realized legal trouble was coming. Greg, however, refused to step down. He still thought he could fix things, that if he just ignored the chaos long enough, it would go away. It didn't. The final nail in the coffin came when the HOA's insurance company pulled out. With lawsuits piling up, a criminal investigation underway, and city officials breathing down their necks, the company wanted nothing to do with them. Without insurance, the HOA was left completely vulnerable and completely broke. Greg finally cracked. He packed up and left the neighborhood in the middle of the night, abandoning the HOA he had once ruled over like a dictator. The last time anyone saw him, he was loading boxes into his car, his face pale and defeated. And just like that, the reign of the HOA was over. With Greg gone, the few remaining board members voted to dissolve the HOA entirely. All the absurd rules, the unnecessary fines, the constant harassment, it was all gone. The neighborhood was finally free. And my backyard? Still mine, just like it always had been.